Welcome back to Let's Exchange Notes podcast. I'm your host, Zalika Adams, and my esteemed guest today, no, as you can see, I'm by myself. This is one of those episodes where a black man wanted to share his story, but with protecting the black man's vulnerability, you have to also protect his identity if you want to get the story. So this is the story of Mr. President. I think it's well awaited, especially since we talked about him in episode 0. And this is going to be a story that may ruffle some feathers. So I'm saying right now, do not watch if you're not ready for candidness, as it involves a fetish story and the idea of sleeping and being with a white woman from a black man's perspective and vice versa. She knew that this was going to be that type of situation. So in the event of getting ready, let's start the conversation. I want to set the basis here. This was a conversation that I had with my friend, Mr. President, and this was in November of 2021. And after the conversation with KP, I said, why am I asking such a question to a black woman? I said, well, why don't I ask a black man? And so I called him. And I said, okay, Mr. President, here's where we're at. KP and I were talking about, if you will, a celebrity. And I was saying, okay, he is really handsome. He has this going on, this, and so on and so forth. And he has a widespread nose and full lips. And then it came to pass that he was with or had dated white women. And so my question to him was the same. Let me ask you this. Can unresolved black boyhood trauma, such as being made fun of for things beyond his control, widespread nose, full lips, chocolate skin, ears that stick out, kinky hair, can that lead into white assimilation? And then I went on to say to Mr. President, I want to give a basis for where I'm coming from. Because if he was teased and taunted about these things, could that then lead for him to say, I don't want to be next to a person that looks like my mother, that looks like my sisters, that looks like my aunts and my grandmother, or even looks like me? And so he said, oh, Z, okay, you cooked up a lot in that pot. But I will say, maybe. So I said, okay. Expound on that. And he said, I was made fun of in middle school for having a big nose and big lips by a black girl who had a big nose and big lips. And then it dawned on me that that was starting to affect me, and in a negative way, a self-hatred way. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, you know what? I wish I could go back in time with this brain and say, you really had self-hatred, and school her on her self-hatred. And I said, okay. And he said, you know what? The only thing, though, that delivered me from that was that New Jack City came out when I was in middle school. And as we know, New Jack City starred Wesley Snipes. And so he said the scope and the plight of dark-skinned black boys at that point in time changed. And I said, please elaborate on that. And he said, well, it was all about the light-skinned guy. It was all about the light-skinned guy, light-skinned boys. They got the girls. You got the girls if you were a dark-skinned boy. If you were a thug dark-skinned boy. He said, so I'm not a thug dark-skinned guy. I'm not out here looking like DeBarge. And so this left us in a dating purgatory, so to speak. And I said, okay. And he said, but after that movie, then it was like we were in. And then also, too, when you're getting older and coming out of middle school and going into high school, you're starting to become more of a man. The bones in the face start to fall where they're going to fall. You're becoming more handsome, and the testosterone is kicking in. And when the older girls like you, then that is what recuperates your self-esteem. So I said, okay. I said, well, I want to know about your experience with a white woman. And so he agreed, but he did preference it as such to say, Z, you know I'm different. And I say, Mr. President, I know you're different. And he said, yes, you know I'm different. You know that I'm connecting with the white woman so that I can get off of my black man frustrations, if you will. And I said, okay, what do you mean by that? Well, everything that has happened to black men, connecting with a white woman, that is what my frustrations are getting out. And I said, okay. And he said, but don't think that she doesn't know this as well, because she has agreed and she has said that this is getting off of her black man fix. I said, okay. And I said, well, go ahead and continue. And so with that, he said, Z, let's see. Dealing with white women. It's like going on some type of trip, some type of journey. I went on a safari. And I said, oh, a safari? He said, yeah, she's from the planet Caucasus. I'm from the planet Negro. I was privy to her white world. She was privy to my black world and everything in between. And I said, okay. And I said, so what about first meeting her? Okay, well, on first meeting her, I would say that the contact was easier. And I said, easier? He said, yes, easier. Upon initial contact, it's easier. It's easier to mold her and to get her on your team and to get her to behave the way that you would prefer her to behave. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, you have the same chip on your shoulder as I do on my shoulder, hence removing the chip series. You are angry black women. We are angry black men because we're all trying to fight oppression. White women are angry. Now, I want to make this very clear, and he did too in discussion of replaying this conversation. He said he doesn't want it to be said that white women aren't angry. They're not angry about their place in this nation or this world. That's what he meant about not angry. And I said, okay. And he said, white women are angry. You know, their fa la 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 tra is their swag. And so it makes it easier upon contact. And so I had to pause there because while I couldn't expound with Mr. President, it did beg the question, is this what black men mean when they say white women are easier? Because when it hits the black woman's ear, we think sex. And that's what I have always thought. But perhaps Mr. President meant upon initial contact, it's easier to get to know them or get their number or have a conversation with them. Maybe because they're not on defense, but we'll have to follow up with Mr. President to get more on that. And so we continue. And so I say, okay, what is it about her that you just said, oh my goodness, I have to go down this route? And he said, Z, okay, I'm going to say it. There's something in her little white. Now, that has been bleeped out because we don't want to be demonetized. So from here on out, I always say pistachio. Something in her little white pistachio. And I said, oh. And it was at this moment I stood up and I said, oh my God. And it kind of changed me in a bit because I realized that black women had never, ever been privy to this conversation with such veracity and such certainty and such honesty. And so I really did fall into the role of, yes, I'm talking to a friend, but I really did fall into the role of a journalist at that time because I wanted to know. Because remember, why leads to understanding. And I said, okay, Mr. President, go ahead. And so he said, there's a theory, Z, that we as black people are selenium-based and white people are sulfur based. He said that could be the difference I'm experiencing. But I want you to be clear here. I'm not saying better or worse. I'm just saying different. And so I said, okay. He said, but when it comes to the issues at hand, she could not see things through my eyes. And when we were having this conversation, we weren't too far removed from the events of George Floyd, or we're really never too removed from the racial tension in this world. And so I would have to imagine that's what he was talking about. And he went on to say, Z, when it came to the issues at hand, she would sit in her white corner and I would sit in my black corner. And we just wouldn't talk about it. And I said, okay. After the conversation, I had to take a pause again. And I said, I wonder if black men, white woman relationships are surface. Because I would think that you would be able to talk about anything. Now, again, Mr. President is connecting with this woman for different reasons. And so maybe all of that is not necessary. But what about for the ones who get married or long-term dating? Do you go over these things? These are the things that I started to ask myself after the conversation. And so I said, I want to know full scope about your connection with her, because obviously you were connecting, or both of you were connecting for sex. And so he said, yes. And I said, okay, let's go over the 5 senses. Let's start with sight. And I said, from forehead to chin, what did you find attractive about her? And I did tell him, I say forehead to chin, because normally a fetish could be hair. And they are getting together because of an overall fetish. So maybe it didn't even matter that I said that. But he continued on. And so I said, from forehead to chin, what did you find attractive about her? Z, you know me. I got to go all the way down to the feet. And I said, yes, he's a feet man. And he correlates cleanliness feet with a cleanliness woman is what he's saying. And so I said, okay, so you went down to the feet. Yep, toes are looking good. And so then I can move forward. And I said, okay. And I pressed on the issue a little bit more. Eventually, he said curly red hair. And again, I'm not going to say one way or the other, as I try to remain neutral during this conversation. And so I say, okay, Mr. President, let's move on. Did you kiss her? Yes. And I said, okay, how was the kiss? Different. How so? Remember when I was saying about the selenium-based and the sulfur-based? He said that could be it, because selenium is supposed to lead to silkiness in the skin. The sulfur is supposed to neutralize the skin. And I said, okay. He said, again, Z, I'm not saying better or worse. I'm just saying different. He said, I would say it was almost like kissing like a doll. It was foreign to me. He said, I would say that she enjoyed coming in to my full juicy lips with her thin lips versus her thin lips coming into my juicy lips. And she said as such that she loved kissing me. And I said, okay, I can imagine so. And I said, well, what does it feel like when you kiss a black woman? Oh, kiss a black woman, that's lips on lips on lips. I said, got it. Lips on lips on lips. And I said, okay, let's move on to oral sex. And he says, okay. And I said, did you go down on her? No. And I said, well, why not? And he ran off this explanation. If I can remember this correlation correctly. Z, you know how you start a job and you're working at it and you get trained and you realize A to B to C gets you your product. Well, when you actually get to your actual job, sometimes A and B get you your product, or A directly to C gets you your product. He said, so sometimes it doesn't flow necessarily like the way that you want it to. And men sometimes have to take control because women don't know what they want to go down. I don't know personally what he meant by that. I think maybe he was trying to say he surpassed it and maybe he thought he was going to come back to it, but it didn't happen. But okay. And I said, okay, well, did she do you? Yes. And I said, okay, how was that? I've had better. And I said, okay. You've had better. By black women and white women? Yes. By black women and white women alike. You know what I think, Z? I think that sometimes the heightened excitement of black and white connecting will lead maybe white women to think, I'm about to suck his crazy. And I said, okay. And he said, but then when you get there, then it's really, really not that. And maybe they can't get the mouth around the girth. I said, okay. But maybe there's some black women who have small mouths too. Maybe, but I haven't encountered them. Okay. Because maybe there are white women who can do the same. Maybe. Okay. And again, I said, maybe that's a cop out. And the reason why I said maybe it was a cop out because I do remember years ago having a conversation with Mr. President, and we were talking briefly about what type of white woman that he would be connected with sexually. And he gave me an example. And in the midst of the conversation, I said, well, would you, go down on her? And he said, yes. And the reasoning was because he would want her to have pleasure as well. So it's very interesting to me that years later, we're having this very conversation again, and he does have this white woman in front of him, but yet he decides not to do it. I said, okay. And so I said, okay, Mr. President, we've gotten to sex. So you all had sex. How was it? And I'm going to take a pause here because I want the audience to really think and take in what they've heard thus far. What do you think he said? And he said, phenomenal. And I said, phenomenal? What makes sex phenomenal? And again, what makes sex phenomenal? I wanted to know just across the board, in his opinion, what made sex phenomenal. And so he begins to tell a story. And he says, well, Z, it's been said that sex feels 50 times better to women than it does to men. And I said, yes, I have heard this. And so then he says, yeah, because that has to be the payoff for getting pregnant. Because 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago, there was no rush. There was no Cleveland Clinic. There were no doctors. You were on the back of a donkey or you were on the back of a horse. And just to take a pause for a minute, I remember watching a documentary, and I said to him, I watched this documentary where this video photographer said that he wanted to follow newborns across the world. And the newborn that was in Mongolia, his mother was in labor for 4 hours on the back of a donkey. And this documentary was made in 2005. And so I said, so we really don't have to go back 50 years, 150 years. We could really say right now, and really for women of color, it is dangerous to give birth even to this day. And so then he went on to say, so the payoff has to be large for pregnancy. And so because of that, it feels better. And I said, yes, I have heard that. He said, now here's the key. When we as Black people and our ancestry started to migrate to the mountains, what happened? Lighter skin, thinner nose, thinner hair to be able to handle the harsh cold of the mountains. And with that, the theory is that the white woman's vaginal tract also shortens to be able to adapt. And that makes sense to me. This theory makes sense to me. That's why we were having a conversation. Because if you're talking about negative 50 degrees, the body was just simply trying to adapt to not have that cold air attack the body. And he said, so with that came a shortened penis for the man. He said, so if you have a shortened vaginal tract, of the white woman and the larger black man's penis, it wasn't designed for that. And so therefore it overloads and it explodes. And he said, so for me as a man to see that, in real time, that then contains and explodes my own ego. And I said, right, because at the same time, we still don't have procreation if we don't lead into the man's ego, right? He has to want to say, I want to do that again, just simply beyond it feels good. And so I totally understood that. And he said, so yes, Z. So now back in real time, here she is doing all of this. And I'm thinking, this is the best thing. But this is something that we didn't talk about that I really, really, really wish that we would have, which is, I wonder if you gave that same time to the black women that you dated and really took your time, because it's not to say that a black woman couldn't have done that same thing. You just have to take your time. And I would think you have to take time with any woman. Now, because I was neutral in this situation and in this conversation, I didn't expound on much, and I didn't know where this was going to go. But I'll say this, with the Mr. President conversation, it took me over the edge and thinking, oh, maybe other black men would be willing to talk about their relationships or their just simple experiences with black women. And so Mr. President and I continued to have a conversation that didn't pertain to this, but I think back to that and I think that was such a good conversation for me to receive, because again, black women are generally not privy to such harsh responses and honesty to such a conversation. When I asked him would he be willing to have me speak on this topic, he said yes. And then we had a discussion to kind of recap. And he said, Z, I don't want you to forget that she's in on this too, because that was a thing for me. She is a woman. When you think about this. And he said, yes, she is a woman. But just remember that she did agree to this. And she already knows what it's going to be about. And I said, oh, you tell her? And he said, oh, yeah. Yes, I am going to take out my black man frustrations on your little white pistachio. And you're going to like it because you agreed to be here. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, now, you have to be a little bit twisted and you have to be alpha for this to go through. Twisted, most certainly. Alpha, I don't know, that's still up in the air. But that was the gist of the conversation with Mr. President. And till this day, I still think, wow, I don't think I'll get that type of honesty again, but hopefully I will. But that was just a glimpse into what it means to connect with a white woman, a black man, on a basis of fetish. But I think the argument could be made, are all of those relationships based on some type of level of fetish? Or are they not? Or have they been weeded out? Who knows? Until next time. This is Let's Exchange Notes podcast. I'm your host, Zalika Adams. We'll see you next time.
And this is Zalika's episode something, but not zero.
Not zero.
Solo episode.
Yes.
Take one.
Anything? Nope. I think that's all I got.